The next thing I want to talk about is types of costs that you want to consider when you're thinking about location of a school. And the main difference here is in-state versus out-of-state. If you're planning to go to a public university or you're interested in universities that happen to be public, you need to be aware that they're going to cost different amounts of money if you live in the state that the university serves or if you live elsewhere. Financially, you're going to be charged less tuition if you live in state versus out of state for these public schools, and how much the difference is obviously varies state to state. But in general, you can expect to be saving a lot more money if you go to your own state university. Some of these schools have 100% financial aid for demonstrated need. For example, the University of Michigan has their Go Blue guarantee, where if you qualify for in-state tuition and your family makes under $65,000 a year, you don't have to pay for tuition or fees or room and board. They cover that with scholarships and grant money rather than with loans, and you have the ability to attend that university basically for free. Similarly, Delaware has a program called the SEED program, and that's statewide. It's not affiliated with any particular university. And so any public university in Delaware, as long as you maintain a certain GPA or if you have a certain SAT or ACT score, SEED program will cover whatever remains of your tuition after financial aid. So that's a really important thing to consider, is what kinds of financial aid will you be receiving based on where you live and where the school is that you want to attend. Of course, this only applies to public universities. Private institutions generally don't have a difference in terms of cost for people based in different locations. However, there are some regional consortiums that come into play. For example, the University of Maine extends in-state tuition to people who live in almost any state in the Northeast. So not just Maine, but also New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Rhode Island. And so even though you don't live in Maine, you can still pay in-state tuition. And that's part of a greater consortium as well called the New England Board of Higher Education. And they have a tuition break program where you can usually pay less to go to a public university in another state in New England. You may not be paying all the way down to in-state tuition, but you can usually pay an average of $8,000 less per year. So that's definitely something to consider for the regional aspect of it. Similarly, on the West Coast, there's something called the Western Undergraduate Exchange Program, and this is for people who live in the Western United States, but not necessarily in the state to which they are applying to college. And so Arizona and Alaska and California, Colorado, Hawaii, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, New Mexico, North Dakota, South Dakota, Oregon, Utah, Washington, and Wyoming are part of this partnership. So you can be eligible for tuition at 150% of resident tuition for your undergraduate career, which might be a little bit less than what you would have to pay if you were from elsewhere in the country. And so this applies to over 160 schools on the West Coast, which is important to know if you're from any of those states. Are there any questions about how financial aid works for in-state versus out-of-state? As you're thinking of your questions and putting them in the box, I also want to say a couple words about international students. Financial aid is often limited for international students, and many schools are need aware for international students, even if they are already need blind for domestic. This is not always the case. For example, Harvard and Yale treat international students the same way they do domestic students in terms of financial aid and demonstrated need. But other schools like Stanford and Cornell are need aware. They will take into consideration international students' financial need when they're considering your application. I have a quick question in the box here about receiving financial aid based on your family's income. And the answer here is that you are eligible to apply for financial aid regardless of your family's income. Many schools will try to give full aid to students whose families make below $65,000 a year. For example, Yale doesn't ask students whose families make less than $65,000 a year to pay for tuition and other costs of attendance. However, people who make more than that, who make money above that line, are still eligible for financial aid, just not for all of your tuition to be covered. You're likely to get some aid, but not everything.